The Boeing 737 lurched violently at 37,000 feet, throwing passengers against their seatbelts like rag dolls. In the cockpit, Captain Marcus Hendricks clutched his chest, his face draining of color as sweat beaded across his forehead. His co-pilot, First Officer Janet Mills, watched in horror as Hendricks' eyes rolled back and he slumped forward onto the controls. The aircraft pitched downward, sending screams echoing through the cabin as oxygen masks deployed like yellow flowers of panic. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Mills transmitted, her voice cracking. "Southwest 2847, we have a medical emergency. Captain is unconscious, aircraft descending through flight level 350. She fought the controls, pulling Hendricks away from the yoke, but her hands trembled. She had only 800 hours of flight time. The nearest airport was Phoenix Sky Harbor, still 200 miles away through a wall of thunderstorms. In seat 12B, a woman in faded jeans and a worn leather jacket listened to the chaos above the screaming passengers. Her calloused fingers gripped the armrests, but her breathing remained steady. At 34, Katerina Ghost, Volkov had weathered worse storms than this. The tattoo on her left wrist, a pair of wings wrapped around coordinates, caught the cabin's emergency lighting. Those coordinates marked a place in Afghanistan where she'd learned that sometimes the only way out of hell was straight through it. The aircraft shuddered again, losing altitude rapidly. Through her window, Ghost could see the desert landscape growing larger, the geometric patterns of Phoenix sprawling like a circuit board beneath gathering storm clouds. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, ignoring the flight attendant's protests. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," the attendant shouted over the din. Ghost moved forward with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to moving under fire. She'd flown everything from Predator drones to F-16 Falcons, logged over 3,000 combat hours in theaters where mistakes meant death. But that was before the incident in Kandahar, before the investigation, before her wings were clipped and her security clearance revoked, leaving her to work as a flight instructor at a small regional airport, her reputation reduced to whispers and sideways glances. The cockpit door was locked, protocol in the post-9/11 world, but Ghost could hear Mills' panicked radio calls through the thin aluminum. She knocked firmly, her voice cutting through the hysteria with military precision. "First Officer Mills, I'm a former Air Force pilot. Let me help." Inside the cockpit, Mills looked back at the door, her eyes wide with desperation. The storm ahead was growing darker, lightning flickering like camera flashes across towering cumulonimbus clouds. The aircraft continued its uncontrolled descent, now passing through 28,000 feet. The woman outside spoke again, quieter now but somehow more commanding. "I can land this." Mills hesitated for exactly 3 seconds, 3 seconds that would change everything. Her training said never to open the cockpit door during an emergency, but her training had never prepared her for this. Captain Hendricks was unconscious, possibly dying, and the storm ahead looked like the mouth of hell itself. With shaking hands, she reached for the door lock. The door opened to reveal a woman who looked more like a mechanic than a passenger. Ghost's dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her green eyes held the kind of calm that only comes from having stared death in the face and walked away. She moved into the cramped cockpit with practiced efficiency, her gaze immediately scanning the instrument panel with the systematic precision of a combat pilot. "How long has he been out?" Ghost asked, checking Hendricks' pulse while simultaneously reading the flight instruments. The captain's heartbeat was weak and irregular, likely a massive coronary event. 2 minutes, maybe 3, Mills replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never landed in weather like this. I'm not qualified for." "Move over," Ghost said, settling into the captain's seat without ceremony. Her hands found the controls with muscle memory older than thought. The yoke felt different from military aircraft, heavier, less responsive, but aircraft were aircraft. Physics didn't change just because you were flying civilians instead of soldiers. She keyed the radio with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years coordinating with air traffic control under fire. Phoenix approach, Southwest 2847, declaring emergency. We have an incapacitated captain and are requesting immediate vectors to Sky Harbor. Souls on board 147, fuel remaining approximately 2 hours. The response crackled through the headset. Southwest 2847, Phoenix approach. Understand emergency. Be advised we have severe thunderstorms moving through the area. Recommend divert to Flagstaff or Tucson. Ghost studied the weather radar, its green and red splotches painting a picture of atmospheric violence that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Flagstaff was too small for a 737. Tucson would mean flying through the worst of the storm cells. Phoenix was their only real option, even if it meant threading the needle between supercells that could tear an aircraft apart. Negative Phoenix, we're coming to you, she transmitted, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had once commanded respect in briefing rooms across 3 continents. We'll take the approach you give us. Mills stared at her in amazement. Who are you? Ghost made minute adjustments to the aircraft's heading, her movements economical and precise. The storm loomed ahead like a wall of purple-black clouds shot through with veins of lightning. She'd flown through worse: insurgent fire over Helmand Province, sandstorms that turned day into night, emergency landings on damaged runways while mortars fell like deadly rain. Someone who should have stayed retired, she murmured, then louder. First Officer Mills, I need you to run the emergency checklist. We're going to get these people home. The radio crackled again. Southwest 2847, Phoenix approach. We're showing you at flight level 240 descending. What's your current fuel situation and can you accept vectors around the weather? Ghost looked at the fuel gauges. Enough for 1 approach, maybe 2 if they were lucky. But luck had abandoned her long ago in the mountains of Afghanistan. Now there was only skill, experience, and the kind of calm that comes from accepting that some missions don't offer second chances. Phoenix approach 2847. Fuel is adequate for 1 approach. We'll take direct vectors to the field. She paused, watching lightning illuminate the storm clouds like fireworks in hell. An approach, I need you to clear the pattern. We're coming in heavy and we're coming in fast. The aircraft bucked as they entered the first wisps of turbulence, but Ghost's hands remained steady on the controls. Behind her, she could hear Mills working through the emergency procedures, her voice growing stronger with each checklist item. Good. The young woman had potential. She just needed to learn that fear was a luxury that pilots couldn't afford. Through the windscreen, Phoenix sprawled beneath them like a constellation fallen to earth, its lights twinkling through the haze of dust and approaching rain. Somewhere down there were families waiting for passengers who might never make it home. The weight of that responsibility settled on Ghost's shoulders like an old, familiar coat. She'd carried heavier burdens before. The first drops of rain struck the windscreen like bullets, and Ghost felt the aircraft's response change as they entered the storm's outer bands. The turbulence intensified, throwing them around the cockpit despite their harnesses. But turbulence was just wind with an attitude, and Ghost had been dancing with wind her entire adult life. Phoenix approach, Southwest 2847. We have the field in sight, requesting immediate clearance for ILS approach runway 08, she transmitted, her voice cutting through the static like a knife through silk. Southwest 2847, Phoenix approach. Cleared ILS runway 08, contact tower 118.7. Emergency equipment is standing by. Ghost switched frequencies with practiced ease. Phoenix Tower, Southwest 2847, emergency aircraft on approach runway 08. Southwest 2847, Phoenix Tower, winds 090 at 25, gusting 40. You're cleared to land runway 08. Emergency equipment in position. 25 knots gusting to 40. Not impossible, but not ideal for a heavy aircraft with an unconscious captain and a co-pilot who looked like she might faint at any moment. Ghost had landed in worse conditions, but never with 147 souls counting on her to get it right the first time. The aircraft descended through layers of turbulence that felt like driving over railroad ties at 60 miles per hour. Mills gripped her armrests, her knuckles white, but Ghost barely seemed to notice the violent motion. Her focus was absolute, every sensor attuned to the aircraft's behavior, reading its moods like a veteran horseman reading a spooked stallion. "First Officer Mills," she said calmly, "I need you to brief the cabin crew for emergency landing procedures. Tell them we might have to evacuate quickly." Mills nodded and reached for the interphone, her voice surprisingly steady as she addressed the flight attendants. Ghost allowed herself a small smile. The young woman was finding her courage, exactly what she'd need if she wanted to survive in this business. The storm cell loomed larger now, its internal structure visible in the lightning that strobed through its heart like some massive, angry god flexing his muscles. Ghost had flown into storms like this before, in aircraft designed for combat rather than comfort. The 737 was a good airplane, stable, forgiving, built to carry families safely from one point to another, but it wasn't built for what they were about to attempt. Lightning struck somewhere off their starboard wing, the electromagnetic pulse briefly interfering with their navigation systems. Ghost switched to manual flight controls, feeling the aircraft's weight and momentum flow up through the yoke into her arms and shoulders. This was flying the old way, before computers and automation, pilot and machine moving together like dancers who'd rehearsed this routine 1,000 times. Phoenix Tower, Southwest 2847, were getting significant electrical activity. Request permission to deviate left of course if necessary. Southwest 2847, approved as requested. Advise when you have the runway in sight. The rain was coming harder now, turning the windscreen into a waterfall of distorted light and shadow. Ghost activated the windshield wipers, their rhythmic beating like a mechanical heartbeat in the storm's chaos. She could feel the aircraft fighting her, crosswinds trying to push them off course, updrafts and downdrafts playing havoc with their descent rate. But Ghost had learned to fly in conditions that would ground commercial aviation for days. She'd landed on strips carved from mountainsides with Taliban mortars falling around the approach path. She'd brought damaged aircraft home when half their systems had failed, and fuel was measured in minutes rather than hours. This was just another day at the office. The radio crackled with traffic from other aircraft diverting around the storm, pilots choosing discretion over valor. Smart pilots, Ghost thought. Pilots who would live to fly another day. But sometimes discretion wasn't an option. Sometimes you had to fly into the storm because people were counting on you to be there when the weather cleared. She descended through 8,000 feet, the city of Phoenix spreading below them like a circuit board come to life. The airport's approach lights were barely visible through the rain and low clouds, but they were there, a beacon of salvation in the storm's fury. Southwest 2847, Phoenix Tower. You're 5 miles from the marker, maintain current heading and descent rate. Roger Tower, Southwest 2847, 5 miles out. Ghost checked their airspeed, slightly fast but manageable. Altitude looked good. The crosswind was pushing them left of centerline, but she'd deal with that in the final moments before touchdown. For now, it was all about getting the aircraft configured for landing and keeping her passengers calm. Mills had finished briefing the cabin crew and was running through the final approach checklist. Her movements were more confident now, muscle memory taking over from conscious thought. Good. Fear had no place in a cockpit during an emergency. Landing gear down and locked, Mills reported. Flaps 30, landing checklist complete. Ghost felt the aircraft's configuration change as the landing gear and flaps deployed, drag increasing, descent rate steepening. The 737 settled into its final approach attitude like a heavyweight boxer dropping into a fighting stance. Thunder rolled across the desert, shaking the aircraft with sound waves that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But Ghost's hands remained steady on the controls, her breathing calm and measured. This was the moment she'd trained for her entire career, the convergence of skill, experience, and raw determination that separated real pilots from mere aircraft operators. 4 miles out, the approach lights were getting brighter, cutting through the rain and darkness like tracers in a night firefight. Ghost could see the runway threshold now, a line of white lights marking the beginning of salvation. But first they had to get there through 30 miles per hour crosswinds and rain so heavy it looked like flying through a waterfall. The radio crackled one more time. Southwest 2847, winds now 080 at 28, gusting 35. You're cleared to land runway 08. Ghost keyed her response, her voice carrying across the Phoenix airwaves with the calm authority of someone who'd learned to fly when flying meant something more than punching buttons on an autopilot. Roger, Tower. Southwest 2847 cleared to land. 3 miles out now, and the airport was growing larger through the rain-streaked windscreen. Ghost could see fire trucks and ambulances lined up along the taxiway, their red and white lights flashing like Christmas decorations in the storm. Emergency crews who'd been called out on what should have been a routine Thursday evening, now standing ready to deal with whatever came sliding down the runway. She hoped they wouldn't be needed. The crosswind pushed them left again, and Ghost corrected with a gentle input of right rudder and aileron. The 737 responded like a well-trained horse, settling back onto the approach path despite the wind's attempt to push them into the desert. This was the art of flying, not the science taught in ground school, but the intuitive understanding that came from thousands of hours of wrestling with weather and wind, and the fundamental forces that kept aluminum and steel suspended in an element where they had no business being. 2 miles out, Ghost could see individual runway lights now, white and red and green painting lines of guidance through the storm. The aircraft bucked and swayed in the turbulence, but she held it steady through pure force of will and decades of experience flying in conditions that would have grounded lesser pilots. Mills was gripping her armrests again, but her voice remained steady as she called out altitude and airspeed. 1,000 feet, airspeed 145 on glide path. Roger, Ghost acknowledged, making minute adjustments to power and pitch. The storm was trying its best to kill them, but Ghost had survived worse storms than this. She'd survived bureaucrats and politicians and military investigators who thought they knew better than the pilots who'd actually been there when the shooting started. She'd survived this too. 1 mile out and the runway lights were clearly visible despite the rain. Ghost could see the threshold markings, the painted numbers that marked runway 08 like a street address for aircraft. Almost home, almost safe. But these last few hundred feet were the most dangerous, too low to recover from a serious mistake, too fast to stop if something went wrong. The crosswind grabbed them one more time, pushing the 737's nose left of centerline. Ghost corrected with right rudder, holding the aircraft in a slight crab angle to compensate for the wind. At the last second, just before the main landing gear touched concrete, she would kick out the crab and align the aircraft with the runway centerline. It was a maneuver she performed thousands of times in military and civilian aircraft, but never with quite these stakes. 500 feet, Mills called out. Airspeed 140, sink rate 700. The sink rate was a little high, but Ghost had room to work with. She pulled back slightly on the yoke, trading airspeed for altitude, feeling the 737 respond to her inputs like an extension of her own body. This was what separated real pilots from autopilot monitors, the ability to feel an aircraft's behavior through the controls, to sense its moods and intentions like reading the mind of a lover. 200 feet, airspeed 135, sink rate 400. Better, the numbers were coming together, aligning like the tumblers in a safe combination. Ghost could see the runway clearly now, wet concrete, reflecting the approach lights like a black mirror. The fire trucks were positioned along the taxiway, their crews standing ready despite the rain and wind. 100 feet, airspeed 130. Ghost pulled the power back to idle and began the flare, raising the aircraft's nose to arrest the descent rate. The 737 floated for a moment, suspended between earth and sky, then settled onto the runway with a gentle kiss of rubber against concrete. The main landing gear touched first, followed by the nose gear, and suddenly they were rolling instead of flying. Ghost deployed the speed brakes and reversed the engines, feeling the aircraft slow under the combined forces of aerodynamic drag and mechanical braking. Water sprayed up from the runway like wings of liquid crystal, but the 737 tracked straight down the centerline despite the crosswind. Southwest 2847, good landing, contact ground point 9 when ready. Ghost keyed her response as she steered the aircraft off the active runway. Tower, Southwest 2847 clear of the runway. Request immediate taxi to the gate. She'd done it. They were safe. 147 souls who'd climbed aboard Southwest Flight 2847, expecting nothing more exciting than airline food and recycled air, were alive and whole because a woman in seat 12B had stood up when everything was falling apart. As they taxied toward the terminal, Ghost caught her reflection in the side window. Graying hair, lines around her eyes that told stories of too many missions in too many hostile places. She looked older than her 34 years, worn down by battles fought in classified briefing rooms and victories that would never make the evening news. But tonight, in this cockpit, she looked like exactly what she'd always been, a pilot. Mills stared at her with something approaching awe. "I've never seen flying like that. Who taught you?" Ghost shut down the engines and began the post-flight checklist, her movements automatic after decades of practice. "The United States Air Force," she said quietly, "and some very expensive mistakes." The fire trucks were following them to the gate, their lights still flashing despite the successful landing. Standard procedure: any aircraft declaring an emergency got the full treatment, even if everything went according to plan. Ghost appreciated the thoroughness. It showed that someone still cared about getting the details right. As they approached the gate, she could see ground crew members waiting with equipment and emergency personnel standing by. Captain Hendricks was still unconscious, but breathing steadily. The EMTs would take care of him soon enough. Mills was filling out the emergency checklist with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned valuable lessons in the last 30 minutes. And Ghost was already thinking about her connecting flight back to Tucson, where her students would be waiting Monday morning for lessons in pattern work and emergency procedures. Most of them were kids barely out of college, dreaming of careers with major airlines, believing that flying was all about perfect landings and precise navigation. Maybe she'd tell them about tonight. Maybe she'd explain that sometimes the most important thing a pilot could learn was when to break the rules. The aircraft came to a stop at gate B-17, and Ghost set the parking brake with the same deliberate care she brought to every aspect of flying. Around them, passengers were beginning to stir, the adrenaline of survival giving way to relief and gratitude. Some would probably never fly again. Others would walk off the aircraft and forget about their brush with disaster before they reached the baggage claim. But Mills would remember. Ghost could see it in the young woman's eyes, the recognition that she'd witnessed something extraordinary, not just the technical skill of an expert pilot, but the calm grace under pressure that separated the truly gifted from the merely competent. "Thank you," Mills said simply, "for everything." Ghost nodded and began gathering her things: a worn leather flight bag, a jacket that had seen better decades, reading glasses that made her look older than she felt. Just another passenger preparing to deplane, except for the slight tremor in her hands that always came after landing. the aftershock of adrenaline and hyper-awareness finally beginning to fade. She'd saved 147 lives tonight, guided a crippled aircraft through a thunderstorm that could have killed them all. Tomorrow morning, there would be paperwork and interviews and official reports that would reduce the entire experience to a series of checkboxes and regulatory compliance issues. But tonight, for just a moment, she was what she'd always been meant to be, a pilot who brought people home safely when no one else could. The passenger boarding bridge extended toward the aircraft like a mechanical embrace, and Ghost could hear the ground crew making their connections. Soon the doors would open, and the real world would intrude on the artificial environment of pressurized cabins and recycled air. She stood up slowly, feeling the ache in her lower back that came from too many hours in cockpit seats designed for people younger and more flexible than she'd become. Mills was still staring at her with undisguised admiration, and Ghost felt a familiar discomfort with being the center of attention. "What happens now?" Mills asked. Ghost shouldered her flight bag and headed for the cockpit door. "Now you finish your logbook entries and go home to your family. The FAA will want statements from both of us, but that's tomorrow's problem." "I meant about you, about what happens to someone who can fly like that." Ghost paused at the door, her hand on the frame. Through the cockpit windows, she could see the Phoenix skyline glittering through the clearing storm, lights that represented millions of people going about their lives, most of them completely unaware that they just witnessed something remarkable. "Someone who can fly like that goes back to teaching 19-year-olds how to execute perfect three-point landings," she said, "and tries to forget that there was ever a time when flying meant something more than just moving people from point A to point B." She walked through the cabin toward the exit, past passengers who were gathering their belongings and making phone calls to loved ones who probably had no idea how close they'd come to tragedy. A few looked up as she passed, the woman in 12B who'd somehow been in the cockpit during the emergency, but most were too focused on their own relief to pay much attention to another passenger. At the gate, Ghost handed her boarding pass to the agent and melted into the crowd of travelers and well-wishers who'd gathered to meet the emergency landing. She could hear fragments of conversation, passengers recounting their version of events, flight attendants dealing with the inevitable questions and concerns. But Ghost walked through it all like smoke, present but not quite substantial, already mentally preparing for the trip back to her own world of flight instruction and aircraft maintenance, where the stakes were measured in perfect landings rather than human lives. Behind her, the 737 sat at the gate like a sleeping giant, its engines still ticking as they cooled from the flight. Tomorrow it would be inspected and cleared for service, carrying another load of passengers to another destination, as if tonight had been just another routine flight in a career full of routine flights. Only Mills would remember the woman who'd stepped into the cockpit when everything was falling apart and somehow made it all work out right. And even Mills would eventually move on to captain her own aircraft, carrying the lessons she'd learned tonight into a future full of challenges and opportunities that Ghost would never see. The storm was moving east now, taking its thunder and lightning toward other cities, other pilots who would have to make their own decisions about risk and responsibility. Ghost watched it go from the terminal windows, her reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass. She'd fought her last battle tonight, flown her last emergency approach. Tomorrow she'd go back to being a flight instructor whose best years were behind her, whose security clearance was permanently revoked, whose career had ended in a classified briefing room where men in expensive suits had decided that some victories weren't worth the political cost of acknowledgement. But tonight, for 30 minutes above the Arizona desert, she'd been exactly what she was born to be, a pilot who brought people home. The boarding announcement for her connection to Tucson echoed through the terminal, and Ghost picked up her bag and headed for the gate. Just another passenger catching a late flight, carrying nothing more than overnight luggage and the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. The storm had passed, the aircraft was safe, and 147 people would wake up tomorrow morning with no idea how close they'd come to never waking up at all. For Ghost, that was enough. Her reflection in the terminal windows showed a woman who looked exactly like what she was, a veteran pilot whose flying days were supposed to be behind her, whose greatest adventures were supposed to be memories rather than ongoing reality. But reflections could be deceiving, and the woman walking toward Gate C-12 carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd proven tonight that some skills never fade, no matter how much time passes or how many bureaucrats try to bury them under paperwork and classified stamps. The gate area was nearly empty, the last flight out on a night when most sensible people had already reached their destinations. Ghost found a seat near the windows and watched ground crews preparing her aircraft for departure. The storm was mostly gone now, just distant lightning on the eastern horizon and the steady patter of rain against glass. She thought about Mills, probably still in the cockpit filling out incident reports and answering questions from FAA investigators who'd arrived with remarkable speed. The young woman had handled herself well tonight, better than many pilots with twice her experience would have managed under similar circumstances. Maybe she'd make captain someday. Maybe she'd find herself in command of her own aircraft when the unexpected happened, and maybe she'd remember the lessons learned from watching someone else navigate through disaster with nothing but skill and determination. The boarding announcement interrupted her thoughts, and Ghost joined the short line of passengers waiting to board the commuter flight that would take her home to Tucson, and whatever remained of her life as a civilian flight instructor. The gate agent barely glanced at her ticket, just another late-night traveler trying to get home after a long day. The aircraft was a regional jet, much smaller than the 737 she'd just left, but the cockpit windows glowed with the same warm light that had guided them safely through the storm. As she settled into her seat, Ghost could hear the pilots running through their pre-flight checklists, their voices carrying the same professional calm that had once been her trademark. Outside her window, the lights of Phoenix stretched to the horizon like a constellation fallen to Earth. Somewhere out there, Captain Hendricks was probably in a hospital emergency room, surrounded by doctors who would either save his life or pronounce him beyond saving. Either way, he was alive because someone had been willing to step forward when stepping forward meant risking everything. The engine spooled up, and the regional jet began its taxi toward the active runway, past the gate where Southwest 2847 still sat under the watchful eyes of maintenance technicians who would spend the night going over every system with microscopic attention to detail. By morning, the aircraft would be cleared for service and back in the rotation, ready to carry another load of passengers safely to their destinations. But the pilots who flew it would know its story. Word would spread through the pilot community with the speed of digital communication and hangar talk, embellished with each telling but maintaining the essential truth. When everything went wrong at 37,000 feet, someone had been ready to make it right. The regional jet lifted off into the Arizona night, climbing past the last vestiges of the storm toward stars that shone with crystal clarity in the desert air. Ghost pressed her face to the window and watched the lights of Phoenix fall away below, already thinking about Monday morning and the student pilots who would be waiting for lessons in emergency procedures and crisis management. Maybe she'd have something new to teach them. The flight to Tucson was routine, smooth air, clear skies, and a landing so gentle it barely registered on the consciousness of passengers who'd grown accustomed to the miracle of flight. Ghost gathered her things and walked through the small terminal toward the parking garage, where her pickup truck waited under fluorescent lights that turned everything the color of old bones. The drive home took her through empty streets past closed businesses and darkened houses, past the small municipal airport where she'd spent the last 3 years teaching college kids and career, changes the fundamentals of aviation. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work, and it kept her close to the aircraft and procedures that had defined most of her adult life. Her apartment was on the second floor of a converted warehouse, furnished with military surplus and discount store finds, decorated with photographs and commendations from a career that had officially never existed. She poured herself 2 fingers of bourbon and sat in the chair by the window that looked out over the airport, watching the rotating beacon sweep its light across runways that gleamed like silver ribbons in the darkness. Tomorrow there would be paperwork and phone calls and official inquiries into the emergency landing of Southwest Flight 2847. Investigators would want detailed statements from everyone involved, documentation that would be filed away in databases and archives where it would gather digital dust until the next time someone needed proof that miracles still happened at 37,000 feet. But tonight, Ghost sat in her chair and watched aircraft navigate through airspace that had been carved up and categorized and regulated, until flying had become as predictable as driving on interstate highways. The magic was still there. She'd felt it tonight when the 737 responded to her touch like a living thing. But it was buried under layers of bureaucracy and corporate efficiency that turned pilots into aircraft operators and passengers into revenue units. She finished her bourbon and went to bed, setting her alarm for the early morning hours when student pilots would be arriving for lessons in pattern work and emergency procedures. They would listen politely to her lectures on crisis management and decision-making under pressure, taking notes they would study for written exams, but probably never truly understand until they found themselves in situations where textbook knowledge collided with real-world chaos. Maybe one of them would remember her lessons when their moment came. Maybe one of them would have the skill and courage to step forward when stepping forward meant the difference between tragedy and triumph. For now, that was enough. Ghost closed her eyes and dreamed of flying through storms, of bringing damaged aircraft home through hostile skies, of moments when the only thing standing between survival and disaster was the steady hands of someone who'd learned that flying wasn't just about getting from one place to another. It was about accepting responsibility for the precious cargo of human lives and dreams that filled every passenger cabin. In her dreams, she was still the pilot she'd always been, and the sky was still the limitless frontier it had been when she'd first learned to fly. The alarm went off at 5:30, pulling Ghost from dreams of flight into the mundane reality of Monday morning routine. Coffee, shower, uniform, the same worn khakis and polo shirt that identified her as an instructor pilot at Tucson Regional Flight Training. She drove through empty streets toward the airport, past early commuters heading to jobs that kept them safely on the ground. The flight school occupied a small hangar on the general aviation side of the field, surrounded by Cessnas and Pipers that looked like toys compared to the military aircraft she'd once flown. Her students would be arriving soon, a mix of college kids working toward aviation degrees and older adults pursuing delayed dreams of flight. Most of them had no idea who she really was. To them, she was just Ms. Volkov, the instructor who was tougher than the others, who demanded precision in procedures and perfection in emergency training. They didn't know about Afghanistan or classified missions or the reasons why a pilot with her qualifications was teaching basic maneuvers instead of commanding fighter squadrons. That was probably for the best. Some stories were better left untold, some victories better left unclaimed. What mattered was passing on the knowledge and skills that might someday save lives, teaching the next generation of pilots that flying was about more than just manipulating controls and following procedures. The hangar was quiet in the pre-dawn darkness, filled with aircraft that waited like sleeping birds for their daily transformation from aluminum and steel into creatures of flight. Ghost unlocked her office and began preparing lesson plans for the day, reviewing student progress reports and weather forecasts that would determine whether they flew or spent the day in ground school. Her first student arrived at 7, a 20-year-old named Rebecca Torres who reminded Ghost of herself at that age, all intensity and determination wrapped in someone who looked too young to be trusted with anything more dangerous than a bicycle. But Torres had natural instincts and steady hands, the kind of raw talent that could be shaped into something exceptional with the right instruction. "Morning, Ms. Volkov," Torres said, settling into the chair across from the desk. "Are we flying today?" Ghost studied the weather reports on her computer screen. Clear skies, light winds, perfect conditions for the emergency procedures training they'd been working on. "We're flying. But first, I want you to tell me what you'd do if your engine failed on takeoff." Torres launched into a textbook recitation of emergency procedures, hitting all the key points with the mechanical precision of someone who'd studied the material but never faced the reality it described. When she finished, Ghost leaned back in her chair and studied the young woman with the same intensity she'd once brought to target acquisition. "That's what the book says," Ghost said. "Now tell me what you'd really do if you were climbing through 300 feet and suddenly found yourself flying a glider instead of a powered aircraft." Torres blinked, thrown off by the question. I'd follow the procedure. Airspeed, best landing spot, emergency checklist." "Would you?" Ghost asked. "Or would you panic? Would you try to stretch the glide to make it back to the runway? Would you second-guess yourself right up until the moment of impact?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from an extinguished candle. Torres had never considered the psychological aspects of emergency procedures, never thought about how fear and adrenaline could override years of training in the space of heartbeats. Ghost had learned those lessons the hard way, in situations where hesitation meant death and perfect execution meant survival. She'd seen good pilots make fatal mistakes because they'd been trained to fly procedures instead of aircraft, taught to follow checklists instead of trusting their instincts. "Let's go flying," she said, standing up and grabbing the keys to aircraft N739 SB, a Cessna 172 that had been teaching people to fly since before Torres was born. "Today you're going to learn the difference between knowing procedures and understanding flying." They walked across the tarmac toward the flight line, past other aircraft that were beginning to stir as the sun climbed above the mountains that ringed Tucson like sleeping giants. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of aviation fuel and possibility that never failed to quicken Ghost's pulse. The Cessna looked tired but maintained, its white paint marked with the inevitable scuffs and scratches that came from training pilots who were still learning the subtleties of ground handling and taxi procedures. But the engine was strong and the avionics were current, and that,